Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Miesbauer, Content Manager at Agiloft. Welcome to today's training webinar titled Creating Custom ID or Counter Fields, presented by Agiloft Implementer Rose Booble. It'll focus on how to customize and organize your data and fields in Agiloft. Presentation will be about 40 minutes, followed by a live Q&A with Rose. Please submit your questions in the appropriate window in the GoToWebinar platform at any time during the presentation. It takes about a minute to queue up the video, so please bear with us as we do that.
Hello everyone, my name is Rose and I'm an implementer with Agiloft, and today I will be speaking on the topic of creating custom fields to identify and organize records, as well as creating counters to track the number of records created that are linked to a specific value, such as the fiscal year, the company, or even the contract type. So to really quickly review what we're going to talk about today, we are going to look at custom IDs and how they are constructed. We're going to look at counters and how they can be used within custom IDs. We are going to have a demonstration of how to use and set up a fiscal year counter so that it counts the number of contracts that are linked to a specific fiscal year. And then finally, we are going to have some time for a Q&A. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the Agiloft ID. So Agiloft out of the box includes an ID field for every table. This ID is an auto-incrementing ID, and it gives consecutive integer values starting with 1. When a new record is created, it is assigned the next available ID for its specific table. One thing to keep in mind is that the Agiloft ID is assigned when the new record is opened, whereas the custom IDs we're going to look at today are generated when the record is saved for the first time. This means that when a user creates a new record and then cancels the record before saving it, that ID associated with the record is never used. So for an example, if a user opened a new record that is auto-incremented as ID 12, but then canceled it before they ever saved it, the next record created would be ID of 13, and there would be no ID 12. So the customer IDs that we look at today are generated with a counter and will not have the same behavior. Instead, canceling a new record before it's ever saved will cause the custom ID to never be generated and will keep the next record in consecutive order with the previous. This is not true of all of the custom IDs that we're going to look at, but it is true of the ones that use a counter. ID is a very important field. It's always completely unique, which means that each table can only have a single record with any ID. If every field in 2 records were exactly the same, it would create issues with searches and linked fields that need to know what record to point at. But because the ID is unique, it serves as the ultimate identification tool. We can think of it almost like a record's social security number. It is always used to have a definitive value to associate with that record. So when designing a custom ID, keep in mind that we need to have a unique way to identify the record. So whether that means maintaining the Agiloft out-of-the-box ID, using it as part of the ID you create, or creating another way to generate a unique value, always keep this in mind when you're customizing an ID. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to refer to IDs and identifying fields, but these do not always have to act as that unique identifier. Just keep in mind that we do need to have a unique identifier for each record. So I'd like to quickly show you what I mean when I say that the Agiloft ID is used up when the record is open instead of when it's saved. So let's go ahead and take a look at a contract table. So here I have the contract table, and the ID used on this table is the out-of-the-box Agiloft ID. So let's open a new record. When I open this record, I can see that this is record 223. So I'll get started on this record, select a contract type, but then let's say something pulls me away and I say, hold on, I'm not ready to enter this record right now. So I'll go ahead and cancel. As you can see, contract 223 was not created because I canceled out of that record before ever saving. Now I come back later and I'm ready to go ahead and create that record. I click New and I can see that this increments to ID 224. So even though I canceled out of that record, the contract ID was used. So let me enter a few things here, just enough to be able to save the record. And when I save, I'll see that that 223 was used in the canceled contract, and my new contract is ID 224. Now that we've looked at the auto incrementing ID, let's take a look at how the behavior is slightly different when we use a custom ID based on a counter instead of the out-of-the-box Agiloft ID. For this example, I have a contract ID that is based on the fiscal year and then a count for that fiscal year. I can see that for the 2019 fiscal year, my latest contract is 19,007. So I would expect my next contract to increment as 19,008. Let's take a look at what happens when we start making a contract for the 2019 fiscal year. I'll select my pertinent information. Give this a title and a description. And I'll select my contract start date. And I want to be sure and select a date that has its start in the 2019 fiscal year, which I can see that I have here. Great. So I've started on this contract. I can even add a company if I want to. And then once again, I decide that I'm not ready to enter this contract right now. Maybe I don't have time, maybe I don't have all the information. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out. I can see that that 19,008 was not created because I did not save that record. And then later, I go back in and I'm ready to enter the contract. So I enter my information again. I again make sure and choose a contract start date that allows it to fall within the 2019-20 fiscal year. And then I save the contract. I can see now that this incremented to 19,008 using that counter because I wasn't using the out-of-the-box Agiloft ID. I'm using an ID whose value is constructed when I save the record. I'm not going to have that skipped ID like I did with the out-of-the-box ID. So to start off, I would like to take a look at creating a custom identifier without a custom counter. So creating a custom identifier for contracts can be easily accomplished by using the compound field data type. A compound field takes the values of two or more other fields and combines them into a single string. If one of the underlying fields changes in value, then the compound field changes as well. So in this example, the admin has decided to identify their contracts through a compound field. They chose to concatenate the record ID and the name of the company with which they are contracting. This allows them to view both pieces of information in a single field and eliminated the need for the company name field to show in views and reports. In this second example, the admin uses the compound ID field to fit a current business practice that they have. So they used the department ID, the company ID, the contract type ID, and the unique identifier, in this case the Agiloft ID, to construct a compound ID that quickly shows all of these properties. So this allows them to quickly view key information about the record through a single field without having to clutter their views with too many fields. Let's go ahead and take a look at how these compound fields are set up. So I'm going to move back to my contracts table, and I can see here this compound ID that we were just looking at, and I want to take a look at how this field is set up. So I'm going to go to Setup Contracts and over to Fields, and I'll move down to my compound ID field. Great, I found it right here. I can see this is a compound data type, and I'm going to go to Edit to see how it's set up. So on this first tab, I can see that I have my field name, and then here on the list of fields, I'm going to select all the fields I want to combine. And I can multi-select by holding down Control or Command, depending on your operating system, and selecting fields. So I can see that I've selected the company ID, I've selected the contract type ID, the department ID, and then the ID field, which is that out-of-the-box Agiloft unique identifier. Now let's say that I want to add in the contract owner ID. I'll just hold down Control and select that as well. So now I've added a new element to my compound field. Let's move to the Options tab. So on the Options tab, I can see all the fields I've selected, and I can change the order. So I want that new contract owner ID that I added to come before the ID, and I can just drag and drop these IDs to change the order however I'd like them to appear. Down here, I can define the separator between the field values. So this is defining that period that I saw between each of the numeric values within my compound field. Let's say that I change my mind and I want that to be a dash between each field. Easily done. I can go ahead and change these all to dash. I see that my last separator does not have a value yet because this is the separator for the field that I just added, the contract owner ID. So I'll go ahead and make that a dash. I can also have a space between fields, or I could have nothing between the fields. I could have them directly adjacent to each other. And then I'm going to leave this option selected if a field is empty, resulting in two separators without content. Remove the first separator. So this just tells me that if one of these fields did not have a value, I wouldn't then have two dashes next to each other. It would just eliminate one of the dashes to give it the same appearance as if it had all the values in the field. Okay, so I've made a couple of changes to my compound field setup. I'll go ahead and click Finish. And then I'll finish again to save the changes to my contract setup. So when I move back to my contracts table, I can see that not all of my contracts have changed, but when I go into a contract and save, it will refresh that compound field value, and I see that my new format will be displayed. And this is an important thing to note about compound fields, is that when you make a change to a compound field, in order to push that change forward, you do need to refresh the record. An easy way to do this is to select all the records, select Mass Edit, and mass edit something that isn't going to change your data. I like to use the demo data field, and this is a field that's used to mark when a record is simply for demonstration purposes, and I just mark all of my records as demo data is no. Confirm. Since none of these records are demo data that I want to clear out, I can go ahead and mark them all as no, and when I do so, since that refreshes the record, I can see that my changes in my compound field are pushed out to all of my records. Now that we've spent some time talking about compound fields, let's go ahead and discuss counters. So counters are extremely useful tools. They're used to count how many records have been created with a specific linked value. So it can be a counter for contracts within a fiscal year, like we saw earlier, a counter for contracts with a specific company, a counter for licenses that correspond to a specific contract, almost anything. While it is more complicated to implement a counter than it is to implement a simple compound field, the benefits far outweigh the time and work for many systems. So we're going to be spending more time on counters because it is more complex, but I think you will see that the amount of time that goes into it is far outweighed by the benefits that it can provide to a system. So let's take a look at a couple of counters that we have. In this first example, the company count field counts what index the contract is for each company. So let's take a look at a few examples of these counters in action. In this first example, the company count field counts what index of contract each record represents for the company. So for example, record 215 here has a company count of Google-001. So that means that this is the first record that was created with the linked company of Google. We also see that the next record, 216, is also 001. This is the first record created with a linked company of Samsung. And then the next record here is Google-002. So this is the second contract created with Google. If the next contract were with Samsung, it would display as Samsung 002. If it were with Google, it would read Google 003. So that count is unique to each linked company for the contract. In this next example, the contract ID field is a custom ID that starts with the last 2 digits of the fiscal year and then has a 4-digit unique identifier. We can see that the first contract in 2019 was 190001. And notice that this is the same example we used earlier to look at the incrementing of these counter fields. So when a contract for 2020 is entered, we see that it is 200001. Regardless of the order in which the records are entered, they will always reference the count for the fiscal year that they represent. Let's go ahead and take a look at this fiscal year counter in action. So I'm going to start by navigating to the contracts table, where I can see all of my contracts with their contract ID that is determined by the fiscal year and the count for that fiscal year. So let's take a look at the 2020 fiscal year. I can see that my most recent contract for that year is 200004. Let's create a new contract for 2020. I will select my required information, my contract type. I'm going to give this a department. I'll give this a title. And then I'll select my contract start date. And the contract start date is what is going to determine my fiscal year. So I want to move into the 2020 fiscal year. For this particular setup, the 2020 fiscal year starts on July 1st. So I can see underneath my contract start date, my fiscal year is fiscal year 2020 to 2021, and that's what I was looking for. I'll go ahead and enter a company for this to make a nice complete record. And then I will save my contract. So I can see that even though the last record entered was 190008, that was a 2019 fiscal year. This that I've entered is a 2020 fiscal year, so this count will be based on the 2020 fiscal year count, which was at 200004, and now I can see that I have incremented to 5. So again, regardless of when the contract was entered, it will have a count that corresponds to its fiscal year. So if I were to enter a contract into the future, let's say that I have a service contract for marketing, and it is a contract that starts in 2023. So this is the 2023 to 24 fiscal year. If I were to save this contract, regardless of the fact that I am entering it, in this case, in the 2019 fiscal year, I can see that that contract ID is still going to be 230001 because this is the first contract entered for the 2023 fiscal year. Now that we have looked at this setup in action, let's take a look at what's going on in the background. So, unlike with a compound field, a counter has to be set up as a separate table. So what we have here are two records. One is going to be our contract record, and then the other is going to be the count record that corresponds to the fiscal year of that contract. So there are three basic steps in play that take place when the record is first saved. Our first step is that the contract table looks at the fiscal year of the new record and searches for the count record that contains that year. So our contract table is going to be searching for a record in our count table. The next step, once the contract table locates the current year, is going to be for the count record to push the count for that fiscal year into the contract record, using the value to create the contract ID field. Our third and final step is that the contract record is going to call back to the count record that it just pulled from and is going to increase the value of the count in that record by 1 to leave the count ready for the next time that it is used. With that basic overview of this process, let's take a look at the specific build-out in order to set up a counter based on fiscal year. So the first thing that I'd like to do is take a look at the new table that was added for this process, the count table. So under my tables, I'm going to navigate to counts. So if we look at these records, we can see that they include a link to the fiscal year, which is from the fiscal year table, which is an out-of-the-box table. And then they also contain an integer field that holds the current count value. Notice that these counts have a very large value, typically in the 10,000 range. This is because the 1 is there, the 1 in the 10,000, is there to ensure that the leading zeros are maintained. If you want a 4-digit number, you would start with 10,001. If you want a 3-digit number, you would start with 1,001, and so on. So the 1 at the front of the number will be stripped away in a later step. Let's go to the setup for this count table. So if we look at the fields in this table, we can see that our count field is an integer field. This is important because it allows us to perform an operation on the value, which we could not do if this field were a string. If we look at the Actions tab, we can see that we have one action related to this process, and that is to increase the value of the count by 1. This action is triggered by a linked record action in the contract table, which we'll look at in just a moment. So that's the setup of our count table. Now let's go ahead and move back to our contract table. So I'm going to go to Setup of my Contracts table. So there are a few key fields we need to look at that involve this process. First, there is the contract ID. So contract ID is an integer field, and its value is set by a rule, which we'll look at in just a moment. The next field to look at is count for this year, and this is a link to the count table. So if I scroll down to count for this year, I can see that this is a link to selected fields from the count table, and this is going to give me the value of the count record that I find when I search for a count record based on fiscal year. I also have a field called counter. This is a text field, and this field is an intermediate field that holds the value for the count before the value is appended to the end of the fiscal year. So now let's move over to the Rules tab, and I'm going to look at the specific rules and actions that create this counter ID field. So under Rules, I want to find the rule that governs all of my new contract actions, which is going to be this one right here. If I move over to the Actions tab, we can see several actions, and we're going to take a look at the ones that relate to this specific process. So our first action that's going to take place related to the counter process is going to be update count for this year. If I open this action, I can see that this is an update action that's going to take the count for this year field, and it's going to update it using a search, and that search is to match to the fiscal year. So this is going to call back to the step in the process where I was searching in the counts table for the record with the proper fiscal year. So this is step 1 in our process. So we match based on fiscal year, and then the count for this year field will be updated based on that information. Our next step is going to be to update the counter field. Remember, counter was our intermediary field. So this is going to take that value in count for this year, and it's going to save it in the counter field. So again, this is an update action. We're going to update the counter field, and we're going to update it using the count for this year value that was just pulled over. So moving back to my step-by-step process, this is going to be part of that step 2, where the count value is pulled in to the contract record. My next step is going to be to create my contract ID. And this is also part of that second step. So again, I have an update field action. I'm updating my contract ID, and I'm updating it using this formula. So this formula is going to take the last 2 digits of the fiscal year using the start date of the contract, and then it is going to append to them the value of the counter, removing that leading 1. So remember, that leading 1 in my count value was there in order to maintain those leading zeros. So this replace formula takes away that 1 and leaves the rest of the counter, appending it to the last 2 years of the fiscal year of the start date of the contract. Finally, I'm ready to move in to step 3 of my process, which is where the contract record is going to call back to the count record and is going to update the date. Update the count for that record. So that's going to be my linked record action that I see here. If I go into this linked record action, I can see that it is going from the contract to the count for this year and moving into the count record. And this is what is triggering that action that we saw in the count table. So this is adding 1 to the count. So again, this is an update action. It is updating the count and it is adding 1 to its value. So this is preparing the count for the next time that that fiscal year's count is called on by the contract table. Now we can see that we've moved through each of these 3 steps. So the contract record searched for the count record. It used that count record in the update field action to update the count for this year. The count for this year was then copied into the counter, and that counter was used to construct the contract ID using the last 2 digits of the fiscal year and the count that was brought in from the count record. Finally, we completed the 3rd step by calling back to our count record and increasing the count by 1 in order to leave it ready for the next time that fiscal year count was called on. Now that we've looked at the setup for this counter field, there are a couple of things to consider when you're setting up custom IDs and counters. The first is strings versus integers and how they sort. So when you sort integers, they order themselves nicely. So integer number 3 will become before integer number 14. Strings, however, like a text field, don't always sort themselves in the correct numeric order. They sort left to right. So for example, the record 912-Google would come after the record 1123-Google, even though the number 912 is smaller than the number 1123. But since the 912-Google starts with a 9 instead of the 1123-Google starting with a 1, it will consider the 912 to be larger than the 1123. Any field that has a non-numeric character in it cannot be saved as an integer field. So this includes special symbols like a dash or a period. The way we formatted the fiscal year counter ID in the previous example, that can be saved as an integer. However, if we had wanted to format it as 19-0001, that could not be saved as an integer because it does have a dash in it. Let's take a look at this string sorting as an example. So let's take a look at the tasks table that I have pulled up here. We can see that the task title is saved as the ID, dash, and the title of the task. Now, when we sort this, we would expect, if this were an integer that we were sorting by, for a record like 269 to appear before a record like 1126. But we can see here that when we sort from largest in descending order, record 985 appears first. This is because this record starts with a 9, which is the largest digit. And I can see that my records that were in the thousands are going to be much further down the list, all the way down here at page 3, because they start with a 1. So this is not sorting in what we would consider to typically be numeric order. Moving back to our contracts table, because we set up that contract ID with the fiscal year and the counter afterwards as purely numbers, this can be saved as an integer field, and in fact contract ID is an integer field, as we saw when we looked at the table setup. So these IDs will sort in correct numeric order. I can see that my IDs are appearing in the correct order, unlike with the tasks table, where they would appear in left to right order, regardless of whether the number itself was larger or smaller than another corresponding number. The other item to note when looking at using a counter field to create a custom ID is that if you delete a record, then the counts will no longer be consecutive. This can be frustrating at times, although it is less of an issue than with the auto incrementing ID, but something to keep in mind. So if you were to delete, say, contract 190004, then contract 190006 would still be in order relative to the other contracts for the fiscal year 2019. However, it would no longer be truly the sixth contract for that fiscal year. It would be the sixth contract created, but no longer the sixth existing contract. As we said, though, that counter ID is only created when the record is saved. So while you will have the issue if a record is deleted, you will not have the issue if you start a record but then cancel it before that first save. So now that we have gone over some information about how to set up these various types of fields, let's look at some inspiration. So we're going to take a look at a couple of ways that these techniques, both the compound fields and the counter, can be used to set up a identifier field for a table that provides a lot of information in a single source. So our first example here is a ID contract type combination field. This is set up using the compound field type, and here we can see that they've taken that out of the box Agiloft record ID, and then they've added the contract type to the record ID, creating a little bit more of an identifier for that contract. Our second example, which is also created using the compound field data type, is the fiscal year and the company. So they have the fiscal year for the contract, a dash, and then the company name. Again, putting two pieces of information in here in a single field. And since these first two examples are created using a compound field, we saw earlier that that is a very quick, very simple setup. And this is something that could easily be implemented within your system. Moving on, we see that here we've used a counter for something a little bit different. This is a license count. So this is being used in a license table. And what this is doing is it's giving us a single field that tells us the count for the license type, and the company with whom that license is contracted. So for example, here we can see this is the first license used for software A, and we can see the company with whom that software is licensed. And we can see the 14th license for software B and the company. So there's three pieces of information pulled together in this single field. Finally, for our last example, we can see here that that fiscal year count, which we went over how to set up earlier, is being used, and we have additional information appended to that as well. So here we've used that fiscal year count and included the department, so the internal department for this contract, and then the company with whom this contract is created. So there are actually four pieces of information being included here. We have the fiscal year indicated by the 19 or the 21, depending on which record you look at. We have the count for that fiscal year, so this is the second contract entered for 2019. Our second entry here is the 14th contract entered for 2021. We have the department indicated directly after the colon, marketing and HR in these cases. And then we have the company with whom this contract is entered. So there are four pieces of information all being pulled together utilizing that fiscal year count that we went over how to create earlier. To briefly review what we went over today, first we talked about compound fields and counters. We went over the Agiloft out-of-the-box ID and how that can be used in compound fields, or how compound fields can be created using other fields from within the table. We looked at an example of how to amend a compound field and how to push that change through to all of your records. We discussed counters and how to set up a counter. We discussed their use, and we also discussed the difference between creating a counter or a compound field that is a string versus one which is an integer, and how that affects the sorting order of records. Next, we looked through a couple of examples to see what each of these use cases would look like. We went through the setup of specifically the fiscal year counter and how that was constructed. We went through the count table that was created to support that use case, as well as the setup within the contract table. We went through the rule that was run on creation and how that searched for the correct count record using the fiscal year, used the count from that record to construct the contract ID, and then pushed an addition of 1 back through to the count record to ready that count record for the next time it was called on using that fiscal year. So we went through the setup for that, and we went through what that would look like once all that setup has been completed. Finally, we looked at some examples of the versatility of this process and how it could be implemented to support a variety of business needs. I hope that this presentation has been informative for you, and I look forward to seeing what all of you create using the techniques that we've discussed here today. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's open it up for Q&A with Rose. I'll start briefly with the one we always get. Will the recording and slides be available after the webinar? Yes. And I notice some of you are having a little audio issues. We will send this as soon as we can within the next 24 to 48 hours. So look in your inbox for that. Also want to quickly start with this great question from Dara. Does the counter look at past records that have been entered, say if we initiated this counter starting in a few months? So basically, does this look at history?
Great, thank you. That is an excellent question. So this process does not look at history, so it will not go back and number existing records, only new records moving forward, but it can absolutely be implemented in an existing system. So your count would start based on the first contract entered once this process is implemented, but you can also change the value at which the count starts. So for example, if you're doing a fiscal year counter, if you already have 200 contracts for the 2021 fiscal year, you could start your count at 201. So it won't go back and count previous contracts, it won't go back and add them, but you can start the count at the value at which it is appropriate to start when you implement this process.
Great. See another one here. How do you know how many digits to make the counter? What is the risk of making it too few digits?
Right. So speaking in general, adding more digits than you think you will need is never a bad idea, right? So it's not really going to be issues to have too many digits. The issue is usually going to be having too few. So keep in mind that the counter is not counting every contract in the same sense, but counting based on how you construct it. So for example, if you're doing that fiscal year counter, you only need to have a counter large enough to accommodate the number of contracts that you think you'll enter in a single fiscal year, since at the end of that year, the counter will reset. So in general, I recommend looking at your past quantities, how many contracts you've had, and then increasing that by a factor of 100 and using that number of digits to count your contracts. Again, you may end up with some leading zeros, but it is better than ending up with too few digits.
Right. That makes sense. Thanks, Dara, for that feedback. We really appreciate it. And again, if you have questions, please submit them in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar platform. I see another one here. How well can this be implemented in an existing system versus something that needs to be done when the implementation initially occurs?
Right, and I think that just calls back to the question about looking at history. So this can absolutely be implemented in an existing system. Again, it won't retroactively number the past contracts, but you can determine the starting point at which your count starts. And so this is something that can definitely integrate well with an existing contract system.
Cool. So yeah, we've had a good amount of questions and people here today. If they want to learn more about these counter and ID fields, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Agiloft Wiki is always a great resource if you're looking for more information on these different field types that I spoke about today and how to use linked record actions like we did in this particular build. We also have the Agiloft community. You can ask questions, discuss implementation topics like this and other topics with other Agiloft users, and that space is maintained and curated by Agiloft implementers. So those are both really great resources if you're looking to get more information about this type of build and how it could fit in with your system.
Great. I want to thank you, Rose, for taking your time to produce this session.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you everyone for being here. And wanted to say, if you've enjoyed this, please check out our full webinar series at agiloft.com. We have a schedule of upcoming webinars, and this is our last one of 2020. And we will return in January with a training session on multiple contract party solutions. So look into that if you're interested. And we just want to wish everyone a safe and happy holidays, and we will see you in the new year. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.